to thank everyone for coming to AIA Monterey Bay's Art and Architecture Contemporary Lecture Series. Our contemporary series focuses on interesting designers doing important work today, especially in the Monterey Bay. And we're very excited this evening to present Jonathan Feldman of Feldman Architecture in discussion with his longstanding collaborators, landscape architect Bernard Trainer of Ground Studio and Brian Groza, founder of Groza Construction. This is our first and hopefully many events we have at Sandbox Sand City. I really want to thank Michelle Jovic, who's standing behind us there, and her husband Mark Talbot for welcoming us to the great space of 440 Ortiz, designed by the late Gerald Lomax FAIA. As many of you know, Jerry was an important part of the case study house movement, working as a primary associate and designer with Craig Elwood for many years before establishing his own firm in Los Angeles, and lucky for us, eventually moving to the Monterey Bay and enriching the lives of our community with his designs, but also his friendship and mentorship for many of us here. Michelle and Mark own and present events in this space, but also live in Jerry's former home and studio upstairs. It was always Jerry's goal to have this be a vibrant community space, and Michelle and Mark have really exceeded his expectations, I think. Michelle is a Grammy-nominated cellist who puts on fantastic concerts of not only classical music, but an eclectic mix of all sorts of presentations. So please go to sandboxsandcity.com to get on their mailing list and take advantage of what they do here. Jerry has to be looking down with a big smile on his face, basically, seeing his legacy fulfilled like this. Jerry would also be happy to see one of his favorite artists' work presented in the space. The beautiful geometric dynamic color paintings you see on the walls are by the exceptional artist Lucas Bloch, who I think is here tonight. Lucas, there in the front row. So thank you, Lucas, for showing your work here. Our executive director, Charmaine Jones, is traveling, but I want to thank her assistant, Lauren Brown. Lauren, it's back there, for stepping in and really making this event possible. AIA Monterey Bay does more than Arts and Architecture Series. I want to make note of some other events we have coming up. Thursday, October 20th, our president, Justin Pauley, who's serving wine back there, has arranged for a hard hat tour of the Ohana Center for Child and Adolescent Behavioral Health, being constructed at Ryan Ranch, and it's recently won a national AIA Healthcare Award for its design by MBBJ Los Angeles. It's a really interesting project with CLT construction, and we're really excited to see it. So watch your mailing list and the website, aiamontereybay.org. October 28th through the 30th is the Monterey Design Conference, and it's back in person at the Asilomar Conference Center. This is always an amazing event with some of the best architects from the US and around the world presenting at this Julia Morgan Design Campus. We're also really lucky to have Libby Barnes. I think Libby Barnes is here from our chapter as member of the AIA-CA Climate Action Committee. And on Friday, November 11th, they're hosting a webinar on creating your sustainable action plan, and it'll be presented by Ben Welty of Feldman Architecture. So go to our website again, aiamontereybay.org, to sign up for that. Finally, I want to encourage everyone to attend our holiday stand award dinner on Thursday, December 8th at the Cooper Malera Barn in Monterey. It's a fun party to close out 2022 and celebrate the stand award winner. We also wanted to celebrate Feldman Architecture's newly published monograph called Immersed, the California Houses of Feldman Architecture. They brought down some extra copies and graciously agreed to raffle them off tonight. So if you saw the metal bowl in the front, you can leave your business card or some piece of paper with your name on it, and we'll raffle them off at the end of the presentation. So now I'd like to introduce the moderator for tonight, who will introduce our esteemed panel, and it is Isabel Verhila from Feldman Architecture, the Director of Communications. Isabel.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you everyone so much for coming. Thanks for coming out tonight, and thank you so much to Eric and AIA Monterey Bay for having us. Jonathan's down here a lot doing work, so we're really happy to come and be part of this community. To start, I'm gonna let each panelist introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their work, their studios, and their relationships with the other panelists, which are very beautiful and long-lasting. So Bernard, do you want to start?
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, I'm Bernard Trainer. I've been in the landscape industry since I was 18 years old. I did an apprenticeship of horticulture in Australia, and then I worked in England for about 5 years, went back to Australia, and then ended up in the United States, and I've been working here for just over 25 years now, so I landed in the right spot to do landscape work, that is for sure. A little bit of luck involved there. And I have we have studios in Santa Barbara, Monterey, and Napa, with a total of around between 25 and 30 people. I have two other owners, Ben Langford and David Leroy. So I'm acting more as sort of a creative director and vision, and everybody else does the real work now, which I love. We have a very good arrangement. The firm has never been better. They're doing phenomenal work at the moment. I'm in a very good situation. And yeah, have just, as I said, landed in the right spot and got to work with phenomenal architects, phenomenal teams with amazing clients all over California. I did something right. I'm not sure what.
Jonathan?
Me next. Thank you. I'm Jonathan Feldman. Our studio is in San Francisco. We are about the same size as Bernard's studio, and in fact, we've sort of slowly grown in parallel and have had a lot of conversations about how to keep the train on the tracks during a pandemic or during the creation of partnerships and all of that kind of stuff. So he's been a thought partner as well as a great design collaborator with me. I had the lucky fortune of the first house that I designed was in Monterey, was in Carmel Valley in the Santa Lucia Preserve. And Brian actually built that house, and that led to a series of projects down here. So very fortunate that keep coming back down here to do a lot of work. And pretty quickly after that, maybe 2 years after that house, I started working on projects with Bernard, and he pretty quickly cornered the market on a lot of my Monterey work because he's so amazing, but he also would travel up north too. So all in all, I've done probably 4 or 5 projects with Brian and probably a dozen or more with Bernard over the years. And they were all there very much at the early part of my career. So as we were planning this event, I was just excited to talk to some of my longest collaborators about just sort of the benefits and the joys and the advantages of working with the same people over and over again. So I'm excited to talk about that with these people specifically tonight.
So I'm Brian Groza, and I started on the Monterey Peninsula in 1978. And right now I sold the company probably 7 years ago, and I've got, so the name is still there, and they're ready to do your work whenever you want it. But since selling the company and leaving the peninsula, I'm in Bend, Oregon now, and working with another company heading up their high-end residential division. And I feel fortunate to have been able to cut my teeth, so to speak, here with a great group of architects, and especially these guys sharing the podium with me tonight.
Thank you. So I think we're going to just start today with talking about one of the first projects that you all worked on together called Butterfly House, which you can see behind you. And I'd love to just hear a little bit about the client, the site, and just kind of setting the stage for that project. And maybe, Jonathan, you could start and just kind of describe the client and how you found them and how that project came to be.
Sure. This was the first project that the 3 of us all worked on together. The clients lived in Berkeley and were looking for a place to move down to and eventually retire to, but to live there part-time for a while. And they found this lot. Well, actually, they were looking at a few different lots, and this site was particularly interesting. It's a super long driveway that leads through an oak woodland into a clearing with these very spectacular upward-facing views. Very, very unique. I mean, I love the projects in the preserve. The land is so beautiful, but all the sites are so different from each other and really kind of drive the projects, and we'll kind of get into that. But these clients, he was an economist and she was a consultant for healthcare strategy. They had a very specific budget. It was very refreshing to have a client who said, put all their cards on the table and said, this is what we have, what can we do? And there's not going to be more money later. And so they were very clear about that.
They'd heard about architects and landscape architects.
Yeah, I didn't realize how. And then, but what was great is that, you know, we just put it all in a spreadsheet, and as the numbers came in, we took things out of the design. And when I remember actually talking to Bernard about this, we kind of had this special strategy of like, well, that budget is going to be a little tough for all of us to work with, so we're going to need to do a special kind of streamlined design process that would allow us to not blow all of their fees on soft costs and leave nothing left for the building, which I know Brian appreciated. But just a wonderful couple who had never done anything like this before and thought it was just sort of a special opportunity that they hadn't anticipated to be able to design their dream home. Very trusting clients, but also a lot of ideas about what kind of spaces would allow them to be excited and thrive. But I'll let the rest of you add on maybe a little bit about either the clients or the site or the setup for the project.
Yeah, it might be a good chance for me to say the top sketch up there is what I remember as the first sketch of the project by Jonathan. And I don't know if we can go back to the first slide, the way you come down the driveway, back one more, this one. So the way you enter the property, you come down the long driveway that Jonathan was talking about, and obviously the beautiful live oaks frame the view to the house. And this was my first realization of sort of what Jonathan was about, because usually there's this, okay, let's hide the roof, let's hide the water tanks, let's not expose the drainage system. But everything is on show. You come through these trees, and here's these three roofs capturing water, taking them down into a swale off to three, I think it's 10,500 gallon concrete tanks that Brian built, all on show. So your first impression of the building is water catchment, roof shapes that fit the topography of the hills beyond. So that was my first recollection was, oh, this reminds me of an Australian architect. Because you see more of that. I'd grown up with corrugated metal water tanks that I thought were beautiful. That here, no, but I couldn't get anybody to use anything like that. It was like, can we bury them? And they're like, oh God, here we go. And then, you know, Paul Bryan's having to bury tanks and triple the cost and everything. So I was just, I guess, impressed with how this architect first thought about that versus here's the facade of my house.
Can I just quickly add that I've never heard you say that. We talk a lot about our work, but I haven't heard that. But I had spent years just tearing through the Glenn Murcutt books that I had in graduate school, who I'm sure is one of the people you're referring to, who was this Australian architect who did have corrugated and always showed his water tanks and things like that. So I had never kind of connected those two things, but funny that you mentioned that.
Yeah, there you see them in the plan. You come down the driveway, that's the auto court, and it's all tanks and roofs and water spilling everywhere. So I would think, you know, more of just the philosophy we should be using. So that was my first impression of Jonathan. It was just went pretty easy in a way. I could relate to it, I guess. So off we went onto a dozen more projects.
While you have it up there, I'll just mention that sketch of those three butterfly roofs really kind of came from us sitting on site, and I think you were probably part of what was behind that sketch. You're not that wasn't this brilliant divine inspiration that I handed you. I think we all struggled with that together. But the site really opened up to this series of these ridges that kind of overlapped each other and formed these sort of V shapes of the hills. And the roofs really kind of took their forms of mimicking kind of some of those hill forms. And so that was what we started kind of playing around with our models and our building forms. And got pretty excited about that as a form in relationship to the hills long before we thought about water catchment and some of those other things. It was just after we had those roofs and we were tilting them up because the views were upward that, I started thinking it would be a real shame not to do something with water when you have these three roofs. So it really was kind of this backward kind of reverse engineering of having these forms that were going to spill water very dramatically, whether we wanted them to or not. And then we started thinking about, okay, obviously water is a scarce resource and collecting them would be a great thing. And we could work with Bernard about how to make a fountain out of this and how there could be a receptacle that could receive this. And so, rather than just, and I think we originally did have a water feature that got value engineered out of the main house, but this didn't get value engineered because, of course, it was part of what the building needed to do to process the water.
Yeah, I think it was mentioned, Jonathan, I think, said it, when you drive down the driveway and this house just opens up in front of you, and you can see that center building, actually, the roof splays out too, which is pretty unique, which added some complexity to the ceiling design and the way it was framed. But the other component there is the way that the house, you step down to get to the front door, and then there's a little connector bridge that goes to the master bedroom wing, and that one originally was set up with like a recessed foundation that was poured concrete. It was kind of meant to look like a cantilevered structure, but as we were building it, we thought that could be, it was kind of set up with a dry stream look underneath it, and we thought, well, let's just make it a bridge. So we actually re-engineered it during the construction and actually had steel beams with steel pan concrete flooring system that was developed that actually was floating, and so that there was a natural, visual, you could see it all the way through it. Anyway.
It's good to just point out upon that because people often, we talk a lot about collaboration, and obviously this talk is sort of calling attention to that, but obviously the design team is heavily collaborating how the building and the landscape interact, but what Brian is pointing out is kind of a special thing when you work with builders multiple times who really start to understand the design intent and the drawings. We were talking about this connector between these two buildings as a bridge, even though we didn't quite design it as a bridge. And Brian was, came to us thinking, it actually would be better if we designed it as a bridge and built it as a bridge. And then the metaphor is stronger, but it actually had all this functional, we don't have to pour concrete down in there. We could just hang it off the foundations that were already there. So it was one of those early examples of kind of working with a really good builder who kind of would evaluate the drawings and make suggestions about how to get the design intent more intact.
Yeah, I think
that became the office too, didn't it? Was above that. So where they would work was above the whole water flow of the whole property, and it went underneath and came out the other side, and you'd see the marks in the meadow of where water was flowing. So it was a pretty powerful office.
That water collection system is actually pretty unique too. The way that it gathers from all those buildings and it goes into a cistern and then it's pumped up into that. And then it's got another set of pumps that take it to irrigation, so it was elaborate. But the interesting thing was that the concrete tanks, I should have held this up closer, the concrete tanks were all board formed, and they ended up, we had to manufacture the metal rings that held that together to get it to pour without blowing out.
And what Brian means by elaborate is a pain in the ass to build.
Yeah, Brian's gotten polite about description. I did want to point out one thing that's, like, I always think about how buildings shape the way people lives and landscapes and design in general. And you pointing out that office that we placed their desks in this bridge that was floating above the ground and looking over the meadow. I've stayed in touch with the clients, and we've done more projects. They moved up to San Francisco, and I helped them fix up a house there. But they kept not retiring, I think, because that office was so nice. And I think they really started enjoying their job a lot more. And so it's one of those just possible examples of how buildings shape the patterns of life. And maybe in a bad way, right? Because maybe they would have been happier if they retired, but.
Yeah, I'm interested in the visioning process, and I know that Brian kind of sometimes comes in as the editor. So Brian, maybe you could talk a little bit more about your role in the design itself, and just how you kind of approached their interpretation of the site and the building, and what you kind of, if there's anything else you took or added to that based on the budget.
Yeah, so it was having worked with Jonathan, this was the second house that we did with Jonathan, and so I was familiar with Jonathan and appreciated his, openness to what the contractor had to say, and took advantage of that experience and things like that. And so this particular house, besides the, there's a lot going on, and one of the things that even was interesting, the actual the ceiling of this was all wood, Baltic birch, and it, the owner was a real audiophile, and he was worried about that, and so we had each one of the panels CNC'd with holes in it to get the good acoustic quality out of it. So, yeah, great project though. And this was interesting too. This is another thing that I thought about afterward. The pavers looked so good, the concrete pavers, and they were spaced like 4 inches apart. And I said, that's no good. Who wants to do that? You step on that with your high heel or whatever, and you're going to trip. And now you look at it now, the finished product, and it's beautiful. It's soft and it's solid, and it's not going to do what the contractor thought.
I was just going to add in terms of
you just can't wear high heel shoes, Brian.
Yeah, right.
That's limiting for Brian, I know. I was going to say, just in terms of, I remember, so these clients did have this specific budget, and like so many times in our process, prices were going up during the year and a half that we were designing this, and so in some ways the budget was shrinking, right, because the program was the same and everything cost more. But I do remember the first house that we did together had very immaculate concrete walls, board form concrete walls, where we sandblasted the board forms to get a pronounced grain, and we braced all the walls so there were no tiebacks, and all of that was kind of fussy and expensive and gorgeous. And when Brian put the budget together for these concrete walls, I remember him saying, like, the budget numbers came in much higher than our budget would allow. And I remember him really trying to talk us out of concrete at first, saying, I just don't see how we're going to get there. And then I was saying, I think it's super important, how else can we do this? And you started saying, well, if you don't make me do those fussy walls, right, then and these were clients who who wanted more of an industrial look, right? So we used wider boards, we didn't sandblast them, we showed the tiebacks, and we cut out half of the walls, right? So we basically, I think when we first drew this, these walls kept repeating, and some were in the landscape, and a number of them were in the buildings. And so we did this exercise of how few walls will carry this idea without losing the idea. And of course, I think all design, that's like the question you want to ask, even if you don't have the budget. Like, what is the fewest things that can powerfully make the case, right? And so I think we probably had 9 walls to begin with, and we ended up with 4 in the end, or something like that. And so, it was a lot of hard work, and it was a lot of Brian saying, I think if you use 2x12s, we could get the number down a lot more than 2x4s or 2x6s, right? That kind of conversation.
And Bernard, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the initial visioning process and just interacting with Jonathan on the design and what was your role in that initial site visit and your interaction with the site?
It's hard to remember. This was our first project, and it's hard to remember how silky smooth it went. I think we both look back and go, hey, we've had a great collaboration forever, but it just has gotten better and better and better on the other projects since. So it's shocking how well this turned out.
This was the second one. Remember we did the salamander or the...
Oh, yeah.
the
Right.
Hollister.
Which did have all the walls that went on forever.
Right.
That's interesting. So
and we did blow the budget on that one.
We did. And that, they put us on a diet on this one, that's for sure, compared to that one, which I think we have images of as well, don't we? Yeah. So that was a project that kept spreading out. I think it went, I would say the landscape went seamlessly. Jonathan said something earlier that I've never thought much about is he shares the budget really well with landscape. Like he's as interested in landscape, so I've never heard him say, hey, you've got to cut the budget or we're going to have to take some from the landscape to put back into the architecture. And I have heard that before from other architects. So that part goes really smoothly, and then we're not greedy. I mean, this is a hydro-seeded site. Like it was a blank slate, it was all soil, we did all the native grasses, we plugged in some other grasses, so it's very inexpensive. Most of the tapestry of the landscape, more of the cost went on driveway, water tanks, auto court, the concrete pavers with the 4-inch gaps. And
a couple of your boulders.
yeah, the boulders as well, and then we did have a hot tub off the master bedroom. So the actual, probably 90% at least of the landscape is hydro seed, native grasses and wildflowers. So we're careful where to put the money. So as Jonathan was pulling out concrete walls, we were probably pulling out some lands like water features and other elements, probably a sculpture.
No, and you got us all with a fully gravel driveway all the way through, right? Which really helped us because it was a very long driveway.
Yeah, so we had things like that going on. And I think on this project, more than the first one we worked on, there was more just authenticity and honesty about water catchment, solar, the way the water was going to flow through the site. So I think we're in our comfort zone as far as spending less money and having more raw-looking landscape, if that makes sense. So it's probably a positive thing for you and I mostly. You might have had to talk me out of the water feature, as you've done before.
No, actually, I think we both wanted that water feature, and it just didn't happen.
Yeah. So, Brian, how did we end up on budget? I have no idea.
It was really close, actually. I think the owners ended up, I think the owners ended up spending a little more with the acoustic holes, but really not much more. We had a pretty neat, the hot tub that was mentioned. It was a Bradford spa, a stainless steel spa, but it had a rolling cover across it, which was kind of unique, and that one was, just took some engineering, that's all, but it was good.
And maybe now we can talk about the next project we have. Sorry, this is going a little. Which is another project in the preserve called Ranch OH, which they all three worked on. And maybe we could start by talking about, again, the clients and how this project was sited, because I know it's kind of an interesting story around this beautiful oak tree. And Jonathan, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think that oak tree was just amazing. And there was not that much space between the oak tree and this really kind of magnificent view that opened up to the, what's my orientation now?
Is it southwest?
Yeah, to the west.
Southwest.
Exactly. And so I remember going there a couple times and really kind of being stumped, like, okay, this tree is amazing and we need to capture that view somehow, but is there enough space? We either had to be on the north or the south side. And I remember having those thoughts and really basically having kind of a stumped idea of, here's a problem that I'm not sure how to solve, and then walking through with Bernard and kind of telling him like all the kind of opportunities and challenges that I was seeing with no clue of how to solve it. And then we just started pacing around and drawing and testing some things together, I remember, on site. And I also remember, this was still early in our relationship, being very amazed at how well Bernard sketches, because I wasn't that skilled with drawing on site and kind of getting the ideas out of my head. So we were a great team where I could use my words and he could draw it, and then we could test it out a little bit, and then draw on top of each other, because I like editing drawings more than starting from scratch. But I do remember, like, we kind of got the idea that the building could be a thin bridge in that small piece of land, so that we could be on, because I was thinking it was an either or, either on the north side and then you give up all that stuff on the south, or on the south side. And then, is that the site when we started?
That's it.
Yeah.
We're right next to the entry
Yeah.
there. And if you pull back out again, that view through to the oak, I think we're sitting on the picnic table in about that spot.
Right.
A little closer.
So we had the idea that the main living space could really be this thinner bar that connected sort of the primary bedroom suite from the guest bedrooms, which were a little bit detached, but forming a courtyard. And then the brilliant idea that I think Bernard really kind of set us on was, if you wrap the buildings around, then you really could have a very well-defined courtyard around the oak tree, which would totally change the feeling of it and give you two sides of the house that were really different personalities, right? You enter into this courtyard, and that's the entry sequence into this oak tree courtyard. And it's really beautiful, and it's very different than this kind of wild lands as the hill drops away on the west side of the house.
Right.
So that was exciting, and that was also, I do remember leaving there thinking, there's no way I could have gotten anywhere close to that idea without like this back and forth that we had on site, and being really excited by that.
Yeah, it's interesting because as Jonathan said, you go out to the preserve and you just see all the land and you think, oh, we're never going to cover this home site area. We're just going to work over in this corner, and then you see the program and guest bedrooms appear and all of that, and it's always a little larger than you think. And one of the pivotal things Jonathan and his team did, well, first off, you enter, as you're in the auto court and you turn, you see this valley oak. So that's the view through the walls to the valley oak, this amazing Quercus lobata. And then you sort of take a right, so you acknowledge the tree first, and then you take a right and head towards the front door. And Jonathan, I think you did keep sketching where there was sort of a gap in the building. And from memory, it was about where you put the dining room, somewhere there. And I would say, I'm realizing now, that's probably the best dining room I've ever been in, because it just pulls apart, and it's like you're outdoors. And it's this pivotal moment, because the rest of the house, you're quite cozy and you're in against walls, and then you walk through this room that just completely disappears before you're over towards the guest wing. So it's absolutely beautiful design.
The dining room has multiple sliding doors on both sides of it that pocket into the walls. So in good weather, which is a lot, the doors can be an outdoor room, right? Completely outdoors, and then it can be closed off as well.
Exactly. And that's the game changer, that one room, because in a way, with Jonathan saying that's the room
that's
there,
the image,
it looks like you're outside. But it's, in a way, I think, I don't know, you did that intuitively, where you did have it was too much house for Jonathan. And then when you got to this room,
we designed this room, and then took us months to figure out what program to put in the room, right? Because we needed it to kind of connect the space, and we liked the idea that it could be a breezeway. And I remember the early ideas was that the ping pong table was going to go in there, but it was just too nice of a space for the ping pong table.
That would have been nice.
Yeah.
So that's the side where we're facing southwest when you look straight through the house.
Yeah, and you look one way and you see the oak courtyard, and you look the other way and you see this pool that's cozied up right next to the house and then frames the views beyond.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the clients, and something you all do very successfully is kind of building client trust and kind of having a unified voice with clients, and maybe just can talk a little bit about what it's like to bring clients into design and how to interact with them and work with them on the site and kind of build this vision with them.
You want to go, Brian?
Well, I was going to say one thing that I was going to mention about Jonathan, that, this is early on in the process. You see that, he's obviously involved in the design, but then at some point he turns this over to his project architects, and Brett Moyer was the architect, or the project architect on this, and after the first, these initial meetings with Jonathan, then the project architect was the one that we dealt with all the time on biweekly meetings, and the clients would come out and we'd talk about things. And anyway, I think that's a real key to Jonathan's success anyway, that worked that way. And I do have to say that Bernard gave it was threatened to make sure that oak didn't become a stump when during construction, and we weren't even allowed to eat lunch out there under that, even in the hot sun.
I know, it was that way. And I agree with going back to the client, we all had a fantastic relationship with the client and still do. And the two projects we've shown so far, I think what Jonathan's so good at is he brings the clients in early. I just feel like they're equal collaborators. So we're all hearing the same thing at once, and it just makes us work better. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the clients don't want to be as invested, they're just too busy. Some of them want to be fully invested, but I would say on these two projects we've shown so far fully invested from the beginning.
But I think it's also worth talking about kind of the cadence that we've all developed over time, and that this was a good project. This was our second one, all of us together, and maybe our third or fourth project that we'd worked on. But I think, I try to do this with everybody I work with, but I think these two people here are great examples of people who were able to successfully do it, is that we really push each other and we challenge each other. We don't just bless each other's designs. Like if it doesn't make sense, we say, that doesn't make sense, explain it to me, or I have a different take on what I heard that the client wants. And so there's a lot of friction in our collaboration, but we're really good about doing that in the back room away from the client, where we can let's do the tough love, let's beat it all out, and then when we're in front of the client, not be 100% unified front, but have worked through the issues and then present them different aspects of what we think maybe the conflicting priorities are and get their buy-in. I've seen many times where different members of a design team or a builder and an architect are kind of arguing in front of the client. And, I keep thinking in those situations, the client's paying us a lot of money to disagree with each other, and that must be really frustrating. Like, I'm hiring experts, I'm paying them a lot, and now I'm watching them contradict each other and not lead me in a clear path, right? And so... Exactly, and you're paying for mommy and daddy to fight, right? So I do feel like there's, we need to be efficient with the client, and we need to be skilled and careful about how we're guiding them. But at the same time, there's this trust with the client and with each other of, we still will disagree in front of the client, right? And we will present multiple ideas and have the confidence that the good ideas will rise to the top if we're advocating for them and we're presenting them in a good way. So there's this kind of respectful debate that kind of happens in a rough way behind the scenes, in a pretty curated way when it comes time to a more public conversation or a more client-focused conversation.
Yeah, I'm realizing with what you just said, I think I've forgotten about that. And I remember the first few clients, first 5 projects we worked on together. I could see in the client's eyes, why is Bernard talking about architecture and why is Jonathan talking about landscape? That happened a lot. And I remember they're like, whoa, is he the landscape guy? Because we do cross over quite a bit. I'm a sort of wannabe architect and you love landscape. And I think that works really well for the land. We just have a respect for either. But I think it is confusing for the clients at first, and then they realize it's a really good thing at some point.
And Brian, was there any specific parts of this project that really stick out to you, that you remember the initial design intent or kind of shaping that and making it your own?
Yeah, I think part of that was the outside area there where you had the pool. It was really spectacular, and it, overlooked as it dropped off the property. But then the deck area itself too, that one actually, I think we did modify that a little bit during the process, because at one time it was going to be just all built up with concrete or something, and we wanted it to be softer than that. So we gave it the look with the concrete perimeter, but then we just joisted the rest of it, and we ended up, it added some complexities with, we had to have some fans in there to get rid of the moisture and things like that, but it was and it had that really nice fireplace on the outside too that was, pretty spectacular.
Well, and there's that idea of editing, because I remember specifically about that, it was taking on so much heat because of the western exposure.
Yeah.
Right? And so what we designed didn't realize and wasn't informed by the fact that it was getting so hot. And Brian, of course, boots on the ground, knew how hot it was getting and knew that what we drew might be problematic, and ultimately redirected us.
And how do you push past and navigate through those disagreements? Because I know, Bernard, you talk about that a lot and just say this is what makes us better. And I know you've done that a lot with these people. Wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, less so with Brian. Brian is like so straightforward and just basically arrives at a good solution that you're almost like, yep, that makes sense. He's a man of few words, and Jonathan and I
Talk a lot.
Yeah. Brian's just building and going, they're going on and on again. Yeah, it's funny. We have had many, I think we've done, like you said, a lot after hours in the evenings and sending sketches back and forward to each other and just super excited and passionate. But I think we always get to the point through all the conversation of like, that's it. No matter what it is, if I'm trying to move an architecture wall or you're saying, well, does that pool have to be there? It's just really value his design opinion on everything. We have very few arguments. I guess we just get stuck a little at times. I think something Brian said that is super important, I just want to go back to, is Jonathan this is the way he works with his team, his firm. So I work just as closely with all the people in his office, and he works just as closely with all the people in my office, whereas we're not sort of, no, I'm the hero, keep coming to me. So once we have to solve a lot on the front vision, we've always worked together on that, but then once that's done, our team carries it forward, and there's minor updates, but I think that's why we dive in pretty deep at the beginning to set a vision, and then pull back a little bit.
I was going to say, because my ears perked up when you were saying how we don't argue, and I can remember some knockdown, brawls that we've had.
Oh wow, can't remember those.
But when I think about them, they were really not about like what is good design or what should we do here. It's really like we'll have different design directions where we really are disagreeing. And what I remember, my memory is that it always comes down to we are thinking that we're hearing a different thing from what the client wants. And we all have many conversations with the clients, and of course, people always hear different things, even being in the same conversation. And so what I think we learned pretty early was we're both privy to different information, and we are getting this wrestling match, and then it's like, okay, well, let's clarify, like, which of these things is more important, or could both things be true, even though each of us only heard half of the story? And so that it's very eye-opening, and frankly, I've always been a proponent that the best design comes from the listening part, like it's not from going on a mountaintop and meditating of what's going to be beautiful, right? It's listening to the land, and it's listening to the client, and it's as simple as that. And I always think that I'm a good listener, and sometimes I'm arrogant about thinking that I have the whole story, right? And so I think Bernard, I've learned, is an amazing listener, and hears different things than I do, and so it's us piecing them together. But I remember early on just some frustrating moments that led to really good things, but me just thinking he didn't get what we needed to be doing, and him probably thinking something pretty similar until the light bulb comes off, where we're like, okay, we suddenly now understand that the problem is twice as complex, And that's really an important and rare opportunity to kind of understand that, because then that lets you to a more targeted design solution, because I was missing half of it.
Yeah, I think there was a part where I would hear what I wanted to hear too, particularly being a landscape person, because you have to be so intuitive and so instinctive about all these elements that are hard to explain. Sometimes I would hear certain things and then think, here's what I think they're asking for. You have to do that a lot with landscape. They're not saying, I want a 2-inch by 3-inch tile and here it is in my bathroom. Landscape just doesn't work that way. So I think I brought some of that in on projects, and an example is the recent project we're working on. The client is asking for some really unusual things of Jonathan that I haven't heard before, and I haven't questioned them once, whereas in the past, some of those things would have passed me by, and I would have been like, well, Jonathan, why are you doing it that way? But he's a really good listener, and he'll always come up with very contextual solution to situations more than me. So I admire that.
And here we have, this is the first house Jonathan designed and built with Brian, also in the preserve, which obviously was a long time ago. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this project and just touch on it and how your process has grown and how you've kind of developed and what it was like working with Brian on that and learning from him.
Yeah, it's fun to look back on this project. It was a really challenging site, and the design was really ambitious. It was this oak grove. It was not at all clear where to site this building in a way that would take advantage of the views and not overpower the oak trees that were so stunning on here. So we really just cut it the building deep into the hillside so that all the downsloping adjacencies to the building and the landscape, you could just walk out on grade. And that meant that you needed all these retaining walls. And we broke the building up into these 3 pieces, which actually we've repeated now a number of times in different ways in projects. But there's the primary bedroom suite, the main living pavilion, and then separated is 2 guest suites. So this is a vacation home. And, you know, when I look back on this, knowing what I know today, I think that was too ambitious of a project. Like, it's a difficult thing to pull that off. And I really didn't have that much experience. I had practiced for 3 years. I'd interned mostly doing commercial high-rise office space. So this is nothing in terms of site response and sensitivity. But what is obvious to me looking back on this was I just dove in way over my head, and I needed a ton of help to figure out how to pull this off, which led to me being hyper collaborative and trusting of other people, because there's no way I could have done half of this by myself, right, or figured it out. And so I worked with another really good landscape architect. I worked with a great structural engineer, and Brian was very involved in this project to help figure out the detailing that was very unresolved. I looked back on what the set of drawings was that I gave Brian on this, and it's comical how few things I resolved, and how much I'd show up to the site and Brian would say, so we got a few problems here, but I have some thoughts about how we could solve them, right? And he totally got the design intent, so he was just proposing things that I was like, that's amazing. Or once or twice I'd say, no, let's expose it, let's not conceal it and make it beautiful like your other project. Let's show the honesty of it a little bit more. So there was a little bit of a learning curve, but what I learned in looking back on that is that by diving in way over my head and knowing that I had to trust these people, it just started a career of entering conversations with designers and with builders of saying, how can we all make this thing better than what I'm hoping it is? Here's what I think the design intent is. Now let's all get in there and elevate this thing, or solve the problems that I don't know how to solve. So I really feel like my whole career has been kind of the opposite of that, you know, stereotype of the egotistical architect who has it all figured out and is bossing people around. Because if we had done that, this building would have been a total disaster, right? And my career would have been very different.
Yeah, I was going to say that this house in particular was was exciting for me, one, because of the design. It was a real departure from what was being built in the preserve. That was more of the hacienda type of houses. And so this was a kind of contemporary house. Pushed the envelope with the design review board to be able to get this approved. And then it was really a complex house. And I guess that, you know, this was our first house in the preserve as well. So I really wanted to do this. And I enjoyed the collaboration with Jonathan on this one, because I had an architect that wanted to work with me and get this thing built. And it was a very difficult site. It was on that, it was, you know, it was on kind of a spline that dropped off, and we actually had to, for the septic, we had to core through the hill to get the pipe onto the other side where the septic field was approved. So it was complex. Then we had the green roof deal, and we had photovoltaic panels, and it was definitely, it had a lot going on. But
and you had to protect all of those trees while you were staging these
yeah.
big concrete pours and steel beam.
Yeah, and we had to come up
erections.
with ways to even get the steel up, because we couldn't get a crane in there because there were too many trees in the way. So it was complex. But a funny thing about it, this is the house, the main house, the guest wing, and then there was a guest house that was 400 feet away or something. It was all complete. And that was easy. That was the easy one. Yeah.
Brian, had you done anything even close to something like this with green roofs and this style of house?
Hadn't done green roof. And the other thing about this that was kind of interesting is that we were talking about the concrete, and I think there may be a picture, I'm not sure, of the staircase, the inside staircase, because that one's actually,
Sorry, that's the only one I have.
It's on the website, but it cantilevers off that wall.
It's in the book.
Yeah, it's in the book, by the book.
It's in the book.
Yeah. Anyway, that was the challenge itself, because it had to be spot on, and it had to be done right. You know, when we were somewhat worried about, are we going to get bounce out of that, and with the steel, and it came out great. But you know, it was probably some of the nicest concrete work I've done.
I remember you mocking up these different concrete walls and
Yeah.
testing the sandblasting and having the patience to say, do you like this better than that? And I was like, wow, that's amazing.
And I just have a few other project images. This is Caterpillar House, also on the preserve. That is another beautiful project. I don't know if we want to talk about this one. And I also have, I want to leave a few minutes for questions at the end. But I was wondering if, Bernard, you wanted to talk a bit about Sanctuary, which you worked on with Jonathan, which I think is a really beautiful story of siting a house and kind of interacting the landscape and the architecture. So maybe we can talk for that about a few minutes, and then we can take some questions.
Sounds good. You don't have to go forward, but do you have any other photographs of this one? I have it. Yeah, okay, go back to where you were. But yeah, from the street, this is another oak tree, a different oak tree, Quercus agrifolia, coastal live oak. And Jonathan, it's a small site, smaller than it looks there. And so when we first went there, the first thing I heard, that I remember at least, we'd had a few meetings before this, but from Jonathan's office, they said, we've been wanting to do a bar house. And there were these drawings that came back of this perfectly long house that was just thin. And I remember for some reason just having this reaction to this house, because I've done so many houses up in the Bay Area like this, where you know the type. There's a house in the middle, there's a front yard, there's two thin side yards, one's for garbage storage, the other one's to get to the backyard. They're of no use on $1 million and $2 million properties, so that always irritated me. I thought, we've got to be able to use all the land everywhere. And then I remember bringing it up on a call at one point with his office, where I said, well, instead of the bar house, would you consider just fully breaking it apart so there was just landscape anywhere you went in the house? And they were immediately, that sounds great. And I was dreading this phone call because I'd been thinking about it for days. But basically, they just quickly pivoted, and then we just started breaking the house into separate parts. So anywhere you are in the house, you can see side yards, you can see through clear story to, bamboo on the edges, you can see up to sky, you see everywhere. And it was just I don't think I've ever quite had that response before to an idea and so quickly pivot to something that was just basically went from a bar house where you were going to, basically just go down the center to looking sideways to all these different courtyards. So that was my memory. How well do I remember that?
That's totally wrong. No, I'm just kidding. So my partner at the time, Ty, was leading this project. We both were working on the early concepts, and I remember it was the first project that I think you got to work closely with Ty on, and I had been talking about how amazing it was to work with Bernard in his studio. And I remember when you sent that sketch back and Ty showed it to me, where you moved all our buildings around, and we had done a lot of successful projects by then. So we were not at all offended, but Ty was just blown away, I remember, by, look what happens when you do this, right? You create all these dynamic, like we had a front door at the front of the house, right? And by doing this, what you were suggesting, you actually walk through a series of courtyards and garden paths and enter into pretty much the dead center of the house, right? That's the front door. It doesn't face the street this is a very suburban area where all the houses face the front street and all the backyards, front yards are unused. There are no side yards. And so by just shifting a couple of these pieces around and suggesting kind of the circulation, it turned the whole project on its side, literally, but made it just instantly much better, right? And so from that point on, there was always the joke of, we're going to draw something and then Bernard's going to move our buildings around because he likes to mess with our architecture and he loves that we don't get mad that he designs our buildings. And then he also de facto gives us permission to over-comment on the landscape, right? So there was this layering of just trust that got built, and this was a project where it really kind of went up a level, where literally Bernard was designing the footprint of the building.
I think this will be in the top 3 projects I work on in my career for the reasons Feldman Architect let me just do it, just go all the way with everything about landscape and how it should work with a building. It'll be in the top 3 collaborations and probably the top 3 results, because it's a tiny, difficult site. You don't see it in those images, do you? It looks larger.
And what was great about it for this site, we don't quite get the context, is it's right next to a mid-sized multifamily, kind of unfortunate-looking apartment building. So the idea of creating a backyard that just looks at your neighbors was not compelling. And so by doing this, it was brilliant to do it in a vacuum, but it was really responsive to the fact that if we could create these interior courtyards where our own building is defining the courtyards, then you're looking at the architecture we're creating as opposed to the unfortunate one that happens to be next door. So it was all about and that's why we call it the sanctuary, because we were creating these inner-focused courtyards that didn't look out. They looked back in, and they created this privacy.
It's interesting with this too. I'm noticing with all the projects that we work on, again, I'm noticing things today I haven't noticed before, which is when we photograph the projects, they're almost more about landscape than they are about architecture. Whereas, a lot of other projects, as you know, like there's a photograph of the kitchen and the kitchen details and the bathrooms and the bed. Like, you just don't do much of that. All the photographs are about looking out of the building in a lot of ways.
And that's even after we take photographs, which is way earlier than you want us to, right? Yeah. Because the landscapes aren't mature.
Always.
We don't want to wait the 4 years that Bernard needs for everything to mature, because we need to get that in our portfolio and, get it in front of potential clients and things. And so all of our photographs tend to be the landscape halfway there, to where, like, coming back to our projects 5 and 10 years later, when we work on them with Bernard and landscape architects like that, it blows my mind, the foresight of, what happens when you fully let the landscape envelop the site.
We had a good moment on a call a couple of weeks ago with Brian where he saw the photographs of what the landscape looks now, because he hasn't been back here, and he's like, look at the landscape. That image that's a classic Feldman architecture image. The one on the left is walking in the front door. So you've just come off a suburban street, you enter the door, and then boom, That's it. The building just parts out the way. And that's the garage on the left with the concrete wall. And we got to do some nice fence details, as you can see on that one. Beautiful dark stained fences, and they just went all in, the client.
I want to leave a little time for questions. I can revisit any projects or just kind of general questions for anyone.
I have a couple of questions. One of them is, so what is the, thank you. I have a couple of questions for you. Number one, when did you build these houses? And starting with the first one, what year would that have been?
So that very first one was completed in 2005. So that was the first ground-up house that I did. So we probably started construction in 2003, and frankly, we designed it probably 3 or 4 years before it. There was a recession and slow-moving project development. So 20 years ago.
The other question I have, maybe you can give that back to me. Okay. The other question I have, because I can't remember all of them, but do you ever work with designers from the beginning of your projects?
Interior designers, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and usually, I mean, there's different cadences of building the team, right? And so some projects start with the landscape architect and the interior designer and us all together. Some of them will go through a month or so of trying to figure out what the project wants to be, and then we'll pull in the landscape architect and the interior designer based on what we're sussing out to be the, the aesthetic inspirations. But some clients come to us with a relationship in any area, and sometimes that's sort of a given on the team. So it happens in lots of ways. There have been a couple of projects, including this one, where Bernard was on the project before us and kind of advocated for us to be on that project.
I got the other architect fired. It was just a really bad match.
You looking for the fist
client.
bump?
Yeah. It was a really bad match for the client. They kept telling me what they wanted, and they're really struggling. And I just said, "Have you looked at other architects?" And then they came back. Other architects.
Where is this house?
Palo Alto.
Do you have a question back there?
Yeah, with the butterfly house that you started the presentation with, you mentioned a hybrid streamlined design process, and I'm curious what you learned from this that you still implement today.
I had one thought about that. That one I do remember thinking about our fees and thinking about the budget and having a real conversation with you of, well, for us to pull this off, to make this all pencil out and to spend this amount of money on soft costs, I remember you saying very wisely, well, we're not going to be able to iterate over and over again. We're going to have to give you one idea that we all agree is good and present it to the client, and hopefully some version of that is going to be, it's not going to be the 3 competing ideas and then develop each one further before you pick a lane. So I do remember that, and I do know that knowing that that's possible and can lead to really good things is really causes you to question your normal process sometimes about how much waste is there and how much are we chasing perfect rather than being smart and efficient about our process. But I also know that there have been 1 or 2 projects that we never would have taken on that we've taken on together saying, well, we have this model, and if we all agree and if the owner agrees on this type of path, then we can get someplace a lot quicker. And that if they're okay with the parameters and the limitations of that, then this could be a great project for all of us. And so just having that foresight to know different ways to work and what that way leads to, and when it's a good choice.
I don't need a microphone.
Yes, we are recording this.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Tell me about a green roof. I guess that goes to Bernard.
Yeah, so the green roofs, back through history, they've they've been used not for necessarily the reasons we're using them for today, but often they're used today. I think, you know, in the right climate, I think they're a great idea as far as cooling. I think they're a great idea as far as habitat, particularly in cities. But I think, if I'm honest, we're doing less and less of them because of particularly in hot climates, because of the amount of water they use. Because they're in a very thin soil profile. You can do a much larger profile. We've talked with Jonathan about that on projects. And that's very expensive because Brian has to carry the weight of a lot more soil. So it becomes really cost prohibitive. But in that thin soil profile, they're just, in a hot summer, they're just pumping water the whole time, even with drought-resistant plants, because it's that much soil. It's about 4 inches of soil. Does it insulate? It does. I mean, Jonathan would know more about that. It does. But then you have to sort of think of, is it worth it with all these other... I don't know how you feel about them these days, but we're doing less of them.
Yeah.
Water use.
Well, and so I don't disagree with... I still am a big fan of them, but in fewer instances, and for the reasons that you said. So we did just finished a project recently in Healdsburg that had a green roof, and then we also had the one on Opal Cliff, which was supposed to have a green roof and then ended up just having a rock ballast roof with no plants. And then the Healdsburg one, you kind of led us to a solution where it's probably 80% rock and 20% plant or something, and the plants are sedums and drought tolerant, and they can take the heat in a way, right? And so that's all very true. If it's underneath an oak canopy, right, then it gets the shading and the moisture can stay there more. I'm still a big fan of it. You know, it allows the water to evaporate and it creates habitat, and it doesn't insulate, but it cools, right? So in warmer climates, it does provide that insulation of just keeping the building cool. But there's cost. There's a lot of cost to supporting the weight of a fully saturated green roof, because you have to design it to hold up in an earthquake, in a deluge, right? Like, so that's your worst case scenario, is it's full of water, draining slowly, and the ground starts shaking. And so what you need to do seismically when you put that much load on a roof, potentially, means that you're paying a lot more for your foundations and your grade beams and your moment frames and all of that other stuff. Like, we love glass boxes, and green roofs and glass boxes are very much at odds with each other.
I can't imagine if there was a better example than Monterey County of some of the early green roofs in Big Sur, for instance. So I'm sure people in this audience would know a lot more about how do they last, what was on them, are they still there?
Yeah, where's Aaron in the audience? You want to come up and just field all the questions? Afterwards, ask Aaron about green roofs. He works at Rana Creek, who's one of our key consultants when we're dealing with any kind of living building.
Paul worked on this one, right?
Yeah, Paul Kephart from Rana Creek helped design this one. I was always good at finding people who knew the answers. Like, this was our first project, and we stumbled across Paul Kephart, who's sort of like a national treasure when it comes to living buildings.
He is. And didn't you have Edwin Hamilton do the stonework?
We did.
Probably the best stone person in California, possibly. Yeah, you did well.
And do you want to ask a question?
I have a question, but I just wanted to say that there's a very interesting roof on the Ortega Highway in San Juan Capistrano that anybody who's interested, if they're in the area, should drive by. The Nichols Institute, about 9 miles up, built in 1978. And it's got full-size oak trees and boulders the size of Oldsmobiles on top. It was built from the ground up as a place to hold the roofs. And it's one of the, I'm trying to think of the laboratory that bought it. It's one of these big medical labs that bought Nichols Institute a few years ago, but built by Walter Nichols. When looked from above, from space, you can't tell it from the surrounding chaparral and oak woodland grassland. It's marvelous. And it really shows, if you do it right, in terms of that, all that architectural stuff you just mentioned about holding up the weight and so forth. All native materials, all native rock is fabulous. Back to the preserve, however, I did want to say that you said a few key words that got my attention, and one was to do with, well, your second photo when you showed the valley oak and the focus on the valley oak when you looked around it. You also mentioned the word someplace to do with architects and ego, and how so often you run into egos. Who knew, right? And a few other things that prompted my interest. And also how you collect water. Up until probably about the time you started, that wasn't allowed in Monterey County even. So there's an evolution there. But we did invite friends of mine when we bought the ranch in the first place to create the preserve. Robert Stern and his pal, an old friend of mine, Hugh Jacobson, to the ranch. And I just moved there, and I wanted them to come out as my guests and tell me if I did a stupid thing or not, and what some of the prospects were and so forth. And we had a great time for about 4 or 5 days. And they were cards because they were guests they were friends for a long time, longer than I knew them. And I asked Jacobson what he thought of this architecturally in terms of possibilities. And he said it blew his mind. He was overwhelmed. He didn't really know how to respond. And the reason being, Hugh Jacobson is well known for having a Jesus Christ in every house he would build, or every landscape he would build a home in. What he meant by that was when you enter a home that he would design, the egos, of course, you would open the door and there would be something of you, and you would automatically say, whoever you were, Jesus Christ. But he couldn't stop saying that wherever he was on the preserve, on the Rancho San Carlos, with or without prospects of a house. And he said, how can I do this? I can't compete. And Robert Stern, however, did have ideas that were a little more settled, but these two guys were playing off of each other, and then they went to New York. But with great wishes for success. So I'm very pleased, and I have told you, I've mumbled this to you before, that I'm so pleased that you have shown your intellect, Jonathan, since the beginning, and your everything but tremendous egos. You've shown intellect, compassion, and dedication to the landscape of the preserve, and all of three of you to making it what it is today. And it's a legacy that a lot of people will enjoy and be proud of for years to come. And you've got a long way to go.
Well, thank you. And it's probably worth noting that Dr. Jeffrey Froke was on the design review board that eventually approved the house that you're looking at. So he saw it from the beginning.
I'm curious, how do you pre-plan for the root systems when you're building houses and trees like that, and around so much of that huge root system, that oak tree has got to be insane. How do you pre-plan for that?
On this one? Or?
I can answer that one. They don't always pre-plan for it, and we find out where they are.
We don't know where they are.
But we actually end up, protecting them, do grade beams to get around them and give them room for grow. We, put burlap and give them space to grow. So when we do come across them, and it's often, we manage to, take care of them. In fact, that big oak, it was in that one house, we had some things we had to deal with. But a lot of them were smaller and they were okay. We got the arborist in there to look at it.
A lot of hand digging.
Yeah.
And we should mention arborists. Like, arborists rule the world in California, don't they? Like, they're the first person on the project, typically.
Well, they ruled this design right there, for sure. And I will say, honestly, this house got me in trouble because I thought we could build this close to oaks, and subsequently, all the arborists told me you can't build this close to oaks. And that worked well, and those oaks thrived, but I think the arborists would all tell me but you maybe risked them not thriving more than you should have. But at the time, and this was 20 years ago, the arborists, we worked really closely with them, and they said, we showed them what we wanted to do, and maybe there was some pushing and pulling based on their feedback, and they said, let's start hand digging. You're on the downhill slope, which is good because the roots are going to tend to go uphill to grab the hill and stabilize. But when you come to these roots, we're going to have to either adjust the design, we're going to have to hand cut them with my special arborist saw while I say the magic words that bless them while I'm cutting them. There's a little bit of witchcraft involved with that profession that I don't understand fully. But so it was very involved. It was a little bit risky. We might have discovered things that were problematic that would have led us, into a redesign. And the bottom line is typically people would force us now to be at least 10 feet farther away from those trees than we did in that project.
Yeah, and if any of you have met Maureen Ham, who was out at the preserve for years, she ruled out there as far as trees went, which was great. That's what should happen. So she guided us through everything.
She was on that project for sure.
Yeah, pretty much on every rock. She passed away last year, and very, very special person out at the preserve. So we always met her at the beginning. That was the start of the project, was you would meet about the trees and then talk architecture every time.
Any last questions?
No questions, but I wanted to thank everyone.
Could I say
Thank
one
you.
thing, just going back to what you said earlier?
Sure.
I was realizing tonight, I spent a lot of time upstairs with Jerry for many years before I ever met Jonathan or Brian. And I was realizing he was probably the first person to help me understand how to collaborate with architects. So I just wanted to acknowledge that tonight.
That's great, thank you. So yeah, I definitely wanted to thank Brian, Jonathan, Bernard, and Isabel for such an insightful presentation and all the wonderful work. Thank you for coming.